A great philosopher once said, "If I had my life to do over again, I'd be too tired." You ever feel that way? You ever feel wiped out by the demands of your life, exhausted, nothing left to give? Do you have times when you feel like your strength has left you? And are such times perhaps chronic? And if so, what effect do they have on your marriage, your family, your friendships, your work, your whole disposition and outlook on life? You know, in a recent survey on stress in America, 76% of those surveyed said that they suffer from frequent and persistent fatigue. 81% said that they often encounter what they would term overwhelming stress. 85% have experienced exhaustion-related illnesses. And 97% of working mothers said that they were too busy to fill out the questionnaire. It's a nation full of exhausted people. Well, this is what I'd like to talk about this morning, a condition that we all face from time to time, a condition that can be most frustrating and destructive, namely burnout. Is there any way to defend ourselves against such exhaustion and to become instead the kind of energetic, powerful people God intends for us to be? To become burnout resistant, if you will. This is our question for today. Now, right off the top, I suppose I should begin by saying that I find our text this morning, the story of Samson, to be one of my least favorite stories in the entire Bible. This simply because I find it just so terribly hard to believe and so totally unrealistic. And don't get me wrong, I can accept a lot of really wild things. Creation of the world in a week? No problem. Parting of the Red Sea? I'm with you. Virgin birth? What's the big deal? Resurrection from the dead makes sense to me. I can accept all this and more. I can believe a lot of really wild stuff. But when it comes to a guy whose strength is in his hair, there you lose me, right? And I suppose loss is the operative word here. And by the way, I would just note that our text today contains mention of probably the greatest miracle in the entire Bible. It is so often overlooked. Judges 16, verse 22, it says, "But the hair of his head began to grow again after it had been shaved." Sounds like a miracle to me. Okay. So not one of my favorite texts for obvious reasons. But what's the value of the story beyond perhaps some very early infomercial for the hair club for men? Right? Well, first of all, Samson is important because he was one of the so-called judges who ruled Israel in the crucial period immediately following the settlement in Canaan and the formation of Israel as a nation. Last week, as you may recall, we left our study of the Old Testament with the people of Israel having escaped out of slavery in Egypt and having arrived at Mount Sinai to form the covenant with God. Following this, they then eventually made their way to the land of Canaan, the promised land. They conquered the land and they settled there. They then entered into a roughly 400-year period known as the time of the Judges, in which Israel was not a unified nation, but rather like a loose confederation of tribes, who in times of danger would join together under the leadership of a God-appointed judge. The title not so much being a legal one as we would use it today, but rather referring to a spirit-filled warrior who would lead the people in battle against their enemies. Samson is arguably the most famous of these, being particularly important as a study in strength. Samson is easily the strongest person in the entire Bible, if not in all of human history. We get numerous scenes displaying his tremendous power. For instance, he wrestles and kills a lion by himself. He single-handedly defeats 1,000 well-armed Philistines, Israel's primary enemy. I mean, the guy's amazing. Not even, Arnold Schwarzenegger in his best days, with all the resources of Hollywood's light magic, could do it for him. Could do him justice, let alone, that Victor Mature from 1949 classic, right? Samson is a model of strength. Yet, as we see in our text this morning, eventually even he hits a point where his strength departs from him. This primarily because he doesn't understand what real strength is and how to make proper use of it. And this is the overriding theme of our whole discussion today. That everyone, no matter how strong they are, no matter how much they have going for them, eventually hits a point where they will be powerless and burned out if they don't know what real strength is and how to maintain it. I'd like to consider some of the mistakes that Samson makes that leads to his loss of strength and what we might learn from these mistakes for our own lives. The first mistake that Samson makes is that he fails to connect to the power source. Have you ever heard the story of the preacher who one day following Sunday services was talking to one of the children of the church. And the preacher asked the young boy, does your mother say prayers with you at bedtime? And yes, every night, replied the little boy. Well, what prayers does she use? Inquired the preacher. Well, it's pretty much always the same one, answered the boy. As she turns out the light and walks out of the room, I always hear her say, thank God he's in bed. Is this our relationship with God? Is our relationship with God just an afterthought to our exhausting lives? Or is it a forethought to supplying us with the strength we need? This is something of where we begin. As you may have noted in our reading this morning, as Samson is about to die, in desperation he calls out to God for help, one last bit of strength that he might defeat his enemy. And this is provided, but sadly it's too little and too late. And if we look at the story as a whole, we quickly discover that this is nothing new for Samson. There's only one other time in the entire story that he has anything to do with God, and once again it is only when he is in trouble. Dying of thirst one day in the desert, he cries out to the Lord, and the Lord provides him with water. Samson has your classic desperation spirituality. That is, he only goes to God when he's desperate. He only prays when the situation is totally out of control, not as part of the normal course of his life. It's kind of like that old saying, that no matter what laws are passed regarding prayer in public schools, as long as there are exams, there will be prayer in the classroom. Right? Samson has a desperation spirituality. Curious thing about this, however, each time he does pray, God gives him what he needs, and his strength is revived. Yet in all the other times when he chooses to have nothing to do with the Lord, his strength, while great for a little while, always eventually diminishes. Thus we, the reader, are let in on the fact that while Samson, in his arrogance, may think otherwise, ultimately the only true source of his power is the Lord alone. And the same is true for us. The first great lesson here is that we can have anything we want going for us. Intelligence, love, talent, family, friends, career, health, money, whatever. But none of this will ultimately keep us from experiencing times of burnout, because the power of any of these things is at best finite. The only way to correctly combat exhaustion is to first hook up and stay hooked up to a power source that is inexhaustible. And the only power source that is so infinite, namely the Lord. And how exactly does one do this? Well, there are three main cables that link us up to the greatest of all energy supplies, and they are worship, scripture, and prayer. As we noted last week, regular attendance in worship, grounding ourselves in praise and Sabbath and sacrament and fellowship. Beyond this, then, reading the Bible every day, searching God's Word and studying it with others, and then praying every day and throughout the day. These are the power cables of the life of faith. And none of this is exciting. It's kind of boring, but it's necessary. And it's what's missing in a lot of people's lives and why they constantly struggle. Think of it this way. Recently, I read this article that told of this little village in Chile where water is nearly as valuable as precious metals. And the region is so arid and parched, forcing the village to truck in fresh water over dirt roads from miles away. Until recently, the average person could afford a mere 2 gallons a day, compared to the American average of 90 gallons a day. And buying even this meager amount soaked up 20% of their household income. Needless to say, the bathing was a luxury. But then scientists began experimenting with an ingenious system for obtaining water, and the 330 residents of this little village now drink water, the freshest they have ever tasted, from high above atop a nearby mountain. Using eucalyptus poles as frames, workers hung a wall of finely woven plastic nets, each the size of 8 queen-size bedsheets sewn together. 75 such nets sift the clouds that sweep in constantly from the Pacific Ocean. And a close look at the plastic nets reveals fibers meshed into tiny little triangles. Like dew collects on grass, microscopically small water particles from fog collect on these fibers. 10,000 such water particles must coalesce to produce 1 drop of water. Still, each net collects 40 gallons of water a day. The 75 nets sift a total of 3,000 gallons daily from the drifting clouds and fog. The point? God was already, always providing for them the full resources that they needed. But to take hold of this, they needed to establish a carefully constructed collection structure. It is the same with us spiritually. Everything's there for us, but we need the collection structure of personal devotion. First question to ask yourself if you frequently struggle with exhaustion and burnout. How much is the problem in my life the simple fact that my relationship with God is at best an occasional desperation call, not a constant connection, a real devotion? How well am I keeping connected to the power source, and how do I need to improve that connection? First essential step in combating burnout is nothing glamorous, but something we also often overlook. It's just so simple. Connect to the power source. Directly related to this, then, this notion of relying solely on one's own sources of power rather than the Lord's is then the second mistake that Samson makes that leads to his burnout, namely, he is unwilling to ever get help. As mentioned, Samson is one of the judges who ruled Israel during the period immediately following their entry into the land of Canaan. And this was a time of fierce warfare as the people of Israel battled with all sorts of groups for possession of the land, which of course, unfortunately, continues to this day. The unique thing about Samson in all of this, however, although he had been called to lead the people, unlike all the other judges, in all the battles he faced, he never once called for the people's help. He never once did what a leader of the people was supposed to do. Instead, he fought all his battles alone. Sound like anybody you know? Or maybe it doesn't sound like you. Samson was the quintessential strong, silent type. Have you ever noticed how we always group those two words, strong and silent? This is because this is how we so often understand true strength. That if you're really strong, you don't need help, and most particularly, you never ask for it. You remain silent no matter what. Strong, silent. Well, look at what happened to Samson. All he had to do was ask his people for help, and they would have helped him. But instead, he chose to go it alone, all alone, and thus he was destroyed. And how often are we the same? As we have noted in the past, this is a problem for a lot of people have. Most especially a lot of good, faithful Christian people. They're very good at helping others in need, but when it comes to their own neediness, their own struggles, how life has gotten ahead of them somehow, most particularly when it comes to expressing that need, getting out in the open and asking someone for help with it, well, forget about it, Too proud, too fearful. And thus many often suffer and fall apart in silence. But it should not be this way. Let us not forget that at the very heart of our faith in Jesus Christ is that what we most need, we are not able to do on our own. That's the whole reason Jesus came. Not to do for us what we could do for ourselves, that would be pointless. But to do for us what we could not do but most needed, namely reconcile ourselves with God. A personally unanswerable need stands at the very core of the Christian message. And expressing that need, recognizing and acknowledging it in order that in this way alone it might be finally met, stands at the very core of so many of Jesus' teachings. Think about it. Did Jesus say, "Blessed are the tough. Blessed are those who don't need anybody else. Blessed are the strong, silent ones"? No. He said, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for they shall be filled. They shall be comforted. Theirs is the kingdom of heaven." In the Psalms it is written, "When I kept silent, my body wasted away through my groaning all day long." This expresses a fundamental truth, and when you try to hold in what is wrong with you, when you just can't seem to get over it or beyond it, when it's too much for you, when you keep it into yourself, handling it all alone, it eats you alive. The point being not to hold some endless pity party, forever bemoaning your troubles, but rather to acknowledge what is beyond you, to seek help with it, and then to open yourself to however God is coming to you with the resources to answer those needs, to receive this and to take hold of it. Second question to ask yourself if you find yourself frequently wiped out by life. Ask, how am I trying to go it too much alone? What am I struggling with that is just too much for me? And I finally need to acknowledge this, ask for help that is probably right nearby, eager to help. And will I embrace however God answers my need? Christian author and speaker Joni Eareckson Tada, in her book, Holiness in Hidden Places, she offers the following illustration of this. And she writes, "I am a quadriplegic, yet I can drive a van. My hand is secured to a big joystick so that I can steer, accelerate, and brake. I enjoy being independent, so if there's something I can do, I will, even if it means tackling the drive-thru at a fast food restaurant by myself. Now remember, my hands don't work. That's why last week when I cruised into the drive-thru lane to order hamburgers and Cokes, I prayed for the fellows at the pickup window. Lord, give them patience and give me a smile. Then I moved to the intercom to place my order. When I'd finished explaining no cheese and extra mustard packets, I told the voice on the intercom that I was disabled. There was a pause. Then he said, "Okay, no problem." I pulled up to the delivery window and smiled. Sticking my arm out the window, I asked the cashier to take the $10 bill that was folded into my arm splint. That was a cinch. While he fished for my change, I asked him to place it in the paper bag along with the hamburgers. At that point, the server bagging my order looked over his shoulder. Both young boys, confused, gave each other a look like, "Do you know what she's talking about? Because I sure don't." I smiled and slowly repeated my instructions. They got the message, and then even carefully wrapped my change in a napkin before they dropped it into the bag with the food. Then they handed me my order. I had to ask, could you please lean out your window and wedge the bag between me and the van door? Both boys looked at each other again. I can't reach for the bag, I said, remember? Oh yeah, they laughed. And then they hung halfway out the pickup window to lodge the package between my wheelchair and the door. It was a long reach. So pretty soon, 2 other teenagers inside showed up, and they held onto the legs of the 2 other boys who were leaning out. They were all having a grand old time. Are you set, lady? Are you okay? They asked in all sincerity. Great job, I assured them. God bless you guys. They slapped the side of my van as I drove off. When I glanced in my rearview mirror, they were all waving goodbye and laughing and high-fiving each other. Thank you, God, I thought, for answering my prayer. That could have been so awkward, but it turned out to be fun. This is the daily stuff of my life. It always involves more than simply picking up hamburgers or the dry cleaning. It involves acknowledging my need and then receiving the miraculous ways God works to answer it. I can do all things through him that strengthens me. Second step in combating burnout, don't insist on going it alone. God is offering support to you every day. Ask for it and take it. And then find the third mistake that Samson makes. He fills his life with emptiness. You know, finally, when one reads the story of Samson in its entirety, one of the foremost things one is struck by is just how much this guy has going for him. Incredible strength, remarkable good looks, the blessing of God, the hope of the people. He had everything. Yet in the end, what one is equally struck by is just how little, if anything, all this everything managed to produce. Samson's life was filled with constant activity, yet nothing of any permanence or value was created by it, in his life or anyone else's. His whole life was spent in aimless busyness, seeming to go somewhere but actually going nowhere. And this is the final cause of the loss of his strength. And such is the case for so many people today. We all know just how cram-packed most people's lives are these days, seemingly more so than ever. Run here, run there, do this, do that, never stop, never a moment to breathe, sign up for every possible activity. Why is this? Well, to begin with, it's because we have come to confuse quantity of life with quality of life. Our lives lack quality, which we inherently desire, but we figure we can make that up in sheer quantity. Basically, we have confused being filled with being fulfilled. We have forgotten that less is often more. And this is a major cause of burnout. People are simply trying to do too much, most of which is just meaningless and unimportant. Think about your own life. How much of your own frequent exhaustion is brought about simply by choosing to do too many things, most of which, if you really look at them, are fairly empty and unimportant, things you could really even do without. It's like living on a junk food diet. Every day getting filled, getting that sugar rush, but never really getting any nutrition, and thus you crash. Lives filled with emptiness and thus burning out. In battling emptiness, this text challenges us to do less. But even more pointedly, building upon this, notice how in the story of Samson, his life is filled with emptiness, and thus he encounters burnout, not only because of his numerous activities, but even more specifically because he is not pursuing God's purpose for his life. This is how the story begins. The Philistines are oppressing the Israelites, so God comes to this barren couple and tells them that they're going to have a son, Samson, who is to deliver the people from their oppressors. Right from the outset, it is made clear that this child has a place within God's saving plans. This is the premise of the whole story. That's the point of his strength being in his ear, which must never be cut. It represents a vow, his commitment of his life to the work of God. What we then see, however, as the story unfolds is something very different. We see this individual fail to fulfill his purpose, to ultimately just throw it away. Now, it's made clear at a number of points in the drama that he understands his calling, but what makes equally clear is that he couldn't care less, that it means nothing to him. Yes, occasionally he does go up against the Philistines, but even when he does, it's purely out of personal motive. At the end, revenge. Never some grand divine purpose. This is what the text finally sets before us, essentially. A life that begins with so much purpose and promise, yet which ends so miserably and so empty, because the person never pursued God's purpose for them, just so casually threw them away. The point being, each of us has a place and purpose within the saving work of God, and the final trick to maintaining real strength in this life being to pursue this purpose. Haven't you ever noticed how the people who always seem to remain strong in this life, no matter what life throws at them, always seem to have a great direction and a meaning for their life, something beyond just existing? As it has been said, they who have no central purpose in life fall easy prey to petty worries, fears, troubles, and self-pitying. all of which lead to failure, unhappiness, and loss. For weakness cannot persist in a power-evolving universe. The final step in overcoming burnout and maintaining spiritual strength. Not only do less, but do something that matters. Don't just go about your life. Seek purpose. Seek your purpose in the Lord. Now, how do you find this? How do you find your purpose? Well, obviously, that's a subject for a whole bunch of other sermons. But just as a starting point here, think of this. Simply aim throughout every day, not merely to go about your day, but to open yourself to however God may need you wherever you find yourself. Just strive to make yourself available to the Lord, part of what God might be doing, some larger purpose than just your life. This is what can finally turn any activity, your job or a day that one wipes you out, into something that lifts you up. Not just, how can I get through this day, but how can God use me today? A famous preacher writes, in the days before self-operating elevators, there was a young Christian woman who was an elevator operator in a large university in Japan. She could think of no more monotonous work than operating an elevator all day long. She was miserable and grumbled every time someone spoke to her. She hated her work and her life. One day, however, after observing a number of students on her elevator who seemed very sad, struggling with great problems in their lives, it moved her and it occurred to her that she ought to try to influence these young students. She wanted to help them to find a brighter way of seeing life in the Lord. But of course, to do this, she would have to be willing to change her own attitude towards life. The next day, she started by simply trying to keep a smile on her face instead of a frown. That's it. It was extremely difficult for her, for she hated her job so tedious, but by sheer willpower, she was determined to cheer up whoever rode on her elevator that day. Over time, as she began to see the effect she could have, she began to feel a real calling to this task, and she eventually even looked forward to going to work, for she was no longer just an elevator operator, she was in ministry for the Lord. It invigorated her rather than depleted her. And as the years went by, the students and teachers sought her advice and presence more and more. Many were helped by her bright attitude and optimistic discussions of life and faith. She became known on campus simply as the little problem solver. Many years later, when she finally died, over 3,000 people, former students and professors, attended this simple elevator operator's funeral. All spoke of how she had changed and helped, and in many cases, saved their lives. All this, their lives and hers, made so much more vibrant and alive, they realized, because she had sought something more than just getting through her day. She had sought to be part of God's greater purposes. If I had my life to do over again, I'd be too tired. Do you ever find yourself exhausted, burned out? Remember the story of Samson and be strong. Connect to the power source. Open yourself to how God is offering you help and seek a higher purpose for your life. Let us join together in singing our closing hymn, number 421, Make Me a Captive, Lord. Would you please stand?